Okay, hello everyone. Hopefully some more people will join us, but welcome to Accessibility and AI Coding, hosted by the Maryland Department of Disabilities Statewide IT Accessibility Initiative. Today is mostly going to be about actual use of AI and coding things like HTML websites or maybe apps or what have you, things to consider in that part. But if you're more interested in generative AI with like documents or other aspects, some of what we talk about today might come up in those areas, or please feel free to put your questions in chat and I will try to answer them. Before we jump in, just the usual housekeeping items. We do have live captioning available today. You can use the show caption button on your menu ribbon. If you don't see it on screen, you might need to click the more button to get to it. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our YouTube channel once we're done. Both it, the link to that, and the slide deck will be shared with all registrants, hopefully within a couple days, if not early next week. Excuse me. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in chat or any comments. You can also put them in Q&A. So I'll try to answer them as we go along, but if not, there should be plenty of time at the end built in, so we can address them then. Now, before we get started, I want to try to run a poll quick to see how people are using AI currently at their organization. So I'll give a couple minutes for us to answer this. Um, Ultimately, you know, you can select any of these options. Really, this is just to get a sense of what people are using AI for, how I can maybe talk to some of those points, and to help out in that regard. So you could select any of the options, and hopefully by the end, I can address some of these things. So I'll give that roughly a minute or so, or until I see that all the participants have answered. Oh, I see we've got a couple more people to join. Thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, captioning is available and recording is on. So if you missed anything, don't worry, it'll come back up. Okay. All right. I see we've gotten a couple answers about refinement. Yeah, that's pretty common of using to reformat things. Using it for accessibility. Okay. That's interesting. This will be very relevant to you today. Brainstorming. Yeah, that's a good how we use it too. A lot of the times as a starting pointer for finding new sources and not using AI or minimal use. That's very common too. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that poll. Uh, but ultimately, I see a lot of people aren't really using it for coding and such. Um, I do get into some technical things today, but I'll try to uh, point it more towards refinement and accessibility work because really the point of today is that AI, if you take anything away from today, it doesn't do accessibility unless you tell it to. It might have some things built in, or in some cases, like give you some tips, as I found Gemini does, but it doesn't do the work until you tell it to do the work. So that is the whole message today, for lack of a better term. Uh, I'll share results here. Okay. So uh, let's start with how does AI work? What does it do? Because that's really the cause of our problem here. And I should clarify, one, I'm not an AI expert, so this is going to be pretty generalized and simplistic. And also, two, I'm not saying AI is horrible, never use it. What I'm saying is be cautious and don't trust it to do things because AI works based off of data, as we all have heard in the news in a lot of ways. But it does this by pulling from, you don't really always know where. one of the key things if you're using Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude and you're just using the open model is it's pulling from anything it can get to. So you're getting a representative sample that it's pulling from that's thousands, maybe millions of websites or other documents or what have you. And so you don't know how good that data is. It's just pulling from a vast amount. And then it takes that, crunches it, and finds patterns. So what is the percentage rate of how often these two words go together? Or if I say build a nav menu, it's going to look at 2 million other nav menus and pull parts of it to build a new one for me. And that's the prediction part. It takes all of that, finds those patterns, and then makes predictions of what you were looking for based on your prompt. And one of our problems in accessibility is that you're pulling from a lot of faulty data. WebAIM does their million websites project, I think every year. It might be less than that or more than that, sorry. But the latest one found 95, again, still 95% of websites, the home pages do not meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines A and AA conformance. That's really important to us, especially in state government, because that's the standard that we need to meet to be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II regulations by next year. It's also a problem in general because that means we're not doing anything or we're missing parts of what we need for accessibility. It means that we're not doing even the base level of making things work with a keyboard or adding alt text to images or giving descriptive links or handling color contrast correctly. And so because it's using this vast amount of data that 95% of it is having some kind of conformance issue, your AI is most likely to use those parts that are wrong. And that creates this echo chamber of inaccessible code. It pulls in data, it discards outliers because, it wants to give you an accurate, or it's basing off a model that says these are the most likely things to go together. So it takes in inaccessible content and then outputs inaccessible content, which if you put out there, you're adding to the problem. And so we need to figure out a way to either make sure the AI is using sources that we know are accessible, which requires you to know how to train the AI and build it or limit its resources, find that information and put it in there. Or B, we need to introduce the human aspect, which is, again, the thing you always hear with AI is the human verification. If you're using access or AI to code things, um, and again, this is where I'm getting more into the technical aspect of if you're, vibe coding, you're trying to create like a prototype for an idea, or you want to see if this is possible, or create a new widget to maybe make something on your website work better. Uh, that's where this is going to come in more. But if you're a lot of this can apply to your refinement, your documents and such, or um, if you're using it to fix things or double check things, because it's only going to do some of these things if you tell it to. So the first one is AI model follows standard templates that you have to adjust to fit your app. If you just tell it, I need a navigation menu for my website, it might just go pull a single navigation menu example from, you know, a HTML class somewhere, or it might pull from W3C and give you that one, which would be accessible, but it just gives you the same example that you could just go look at that website. And so now it hasn't really changed it to fit your needs, or you have to have the knowledge to take that code and alter it rather than just run with it. This can be a problem in accessibility because if you take that template and in a vacuum, it might work, but as soon as you start making changes, it may not work. You have to know know what you're doing with it. Or if you tell it change this part, it doesn't change the rest to fit that, which leads us into the second problem of we're addressing code issues, telling it fix this spot or add this to this section. And it does that, but it doesn't change it in the greater whole. And this is important for accessibility because so much of our work is subjective context or how things work in a larger system. Menus are a great example because you can tell it, build me a navigation menu. I want a button with a drop down that I can use to add sublinks. Please make that keyboard accessible. It'll make that drop down keyboard accessible so that the button opens the menu, and the menu then has focus order so that a screen reader or a keyboard user or a voice control user can go through those links and select one, but it only builds it into that one part. So if you have similar parts throughout the website, like a sub menu or something, or another button that uses a drop down and a form, it doesn't apply that to those sections. So you have to either copy paste it or tell it again, build these into these other areas. And one of the other things too, and you'll find this problem with automated testing, is it can't tell you how these work in relation to each other. What is the user workflow through this entire document? And this is something that AI is learning, but it's not there yet. Where you go and click that menu, you click that button and it takes you to that link, but it doesn't tell you what does the link tell you, or if this is an image, how good is that alt text? Is it telling me the right thing? It's just going to put in what are the most common examples of these elements and try to predict what's the best option here to use. So it doesn't look at the overall picture and the overall user experience because it can't make that judgment call. It doesn't think. It just pulls in data points and uses it to create an accurate model. So for our work, because we're looking at this and thinking, am I getting annoyed at this because it's telling me over and over what this item is? Well, that's not a good user experience. And so, or it's missing in this part, but it's in this part. Again, not a good user experience. So again, the user has to look at what it's doing and telling us before we can really trust the AI to do it over. Conversely, it can also over-engineer the solution where it adds extra code attributes that can interfere with native behaviors. This happens a lot with what's called ARIA, ARIA, authoring rich internet applications, which for context for everyone, it's a set of attributes that can be put in, usually into HTML, but you can use it in other areas that add behavior to tell other programs or especially assistive technology, do this or tell the user this. Very useful in our purposes, and in some cases necessary. But the challenge of it is that it can override behaviors that are already there. And I found this a lot when I was trying to use AI to create a widget um, that was hopefully to try and make things more accessible that are traditionally not accessible, like data and charts, because those are very challenging to make accessible. But it wanted to add a lot of extra attributes, which either it's missing the parts that make it function, because say that menu we were talking about before, if it decides not just to use the nav tag and link tags, it decides I want to add role equals menu to the top. Well, now it has to add role equals menu item to all of the other links. Otherwise, that menu doesn't function. Or it adds those, but then it has to add tab index to control uh, keyboard focus, or and it also has to add extra scripting to move focus each time you press a key, which isn't really necessary if you're just using HTML. Like you just need to give it that nav menu and the link tags, and then a little bit of scripting to when you press that button, open this menu. And then ARIA expanded to tell us it's open. So this is the challenge I've always had with it. is it either does nothing, or when you tell it to do something, it does too much. And so again, you have to look at it and decide, is that actually useful? Is that a good practice? Or, is it something that, no, this wasn't necessary, or it's interfering, which is even worse because it added that role, but didn't add the subsequent parts to make that role work. And that's where you would need to go to an expert to say, please look at this. Does it work? Or do I need to trim it or tell it to do something else? And then finally, as we talked about before, is that it pulls from the wrong source for the solution. Either it's using an outdated technique or incorrect information, in some cases, like depreciated attributes that aren't used anymore, like the B tag for bold. Instead, we now use emphasis or strong. Um, Things like that, where it pulls that in, uses that instead, because again, if you're just using the base version of these models, you don't know what sources it's pulling from. You might tell it's, link me these sources, but you can't tell it, do not look at this. Or if you do, that's a whole extra bit to your prompt you have to do. But that can cause more problems because you get into a loop of, you tell it fix this, it changes it, but then something else breaks. And now you have to fix that. And you create this, it's the old adage in programming, you fix a bug and two more appear. So keep that in mind as well, is that if you don't know anything about accessibility, or you're working with this tool and you're telling it do this, again, get someone to look at it before you make it public or you share it in any usable capacity. Because if it decides to add those, that ARIA menu or like a tab panel, and it pulls from, an example from 4 years ago that's using, tab index -1 or tab index equals 0, and then tries to JavaScript the opening of those panels, it might be using an old method that you can find on the W3C that it works, but it's not best practice because DQ found a new way to do it that's simpler and better. So keep all of that in mind. Again, I'm not telling you don't use AI. I'm telling you be careful with it, and you have to tell it what to do or it won't do it. To that end, let's look at an example here. So I wrote a prompt in here with Gemini saying, generate HTML markup and JavaScript for an expandable FAQ section. There should be 5 sections, each answering one question. One example question is, how do I access your services? And then I have a screenshot here of the start of that code. In a bit, we'll look at the full thing to go into more detail. But for our purposes here, I didn't tell it, add any, accessibility markup or uh, add, other functionality or what have you. It just gave me a bog standard HTML write-up, minimal CSS styling to make it actually, look somewhat readable, and then the JavaScript to make it open and close. So for purpose of accessibility, let's look through this code. We have the starting div, so a section that has the FAQ container. So all of our FAQ is inside this. So again, we can apply a styling area to this if we want to say like a nice outline to it. We have a heading for frequently asked questions. So that's good. We have a heading already built in. We don't have to worry about adding that. So a user with a screen reader or with voice control can either, say jump to the heading or press H to move to the next heading, and it will jump to the section. Great, we already have something accessible in there. Then we have our separate groups for each FAQ item. So we have the first question with the button to open it. So that button says, how do I access your services? So when they find that, they'll hear or see, how do I access your services button. You press that button, it opens that section that says you can access our services by creating an account on our website and navigating to blah, 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 blah. And then there's a follow-up one below about hours of operation. So in terms of accessibility, we have some of the things we already need. We have a heading, we have a button, We have a button that tells us what it does or tells us, what is this about? What we don't have is something that tells a screen reader or say a magnification software with reading capability. If I press that button, did that actually do anything? Did that section open? And that's where that attribute already expanded is needed, because otherwise, if I press that button with a screen reader, I don't hear anything. It just doesn't do anything. So I don't know if it worked. Or if I'm using Zoom text and I have it at 300% magnification and all I could see is that button, I click that button, and the read over will tell me how to access your services button. I click the button, and again, something might happen on screen. I might catch it if it's at the very bottom of where I had my zoom high enough or low enough. But if I don't, and it doesn't announce anything, I have to manually scroll around to see, did it work? And so this is where it didn't do some of the things that are absolutely necessary. And I had to tell it to add this functionality. So I followed up with another prompt. And these are some things to look for when you do this. Is act as a digital accessibility expert with strong knowledge of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA standards. Please add markup and attributes to let screen readers use these buttons and receive feedback about their states. So my prompt tells it, I want you to act this way. So pull from knowledge bases that you think fit this job description. B, here are the standards I need to meet. So again, for the state or local government entities, or honestly, really any public entity, uh, or even internal entity, you want to hit at minimum the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. I say AA standards because generally that means include the single A standards. If I want to be absolutely sure, I could say that too. But ultimately, what I need to tell it here is I need you to add markup to do this thing. I need screen readers to know what's going to happen. And so it edited my code, or the first code it generated, and added the following. So we still have our heading at the top, the frequently asked questions, but then inside the div for the buttons, I only have the first section, the first question on here for the FAQ, but it put the first button in a heading. So it's in the heading 3. You could argue that this is useful. You can argue that maybe it's not, because the thought process it had was users need headings in order to jump around through navigation. And generally, you would use a heading to tell us what is the following content about. Now, as a subject matter expert, I would argue heading here might not be as useful because A, we already have a button that already tells us what this does. B, these are collapsible sections. So the content that that heading is leading isn't there currently. So instead of, a heading followed by content in an FAQ, you would just have a series of headings. And at that point, you're kind of defeating the purpose of the heading, telling us, how is the content organized, and B, giving us easy to jump navigation points, because I'm not skipping anything by moving all through all those headings. So if I have an FAQ with maybe 20 questions, I'm now moving through 20 headings that are also buttons. So I'm hearing, how do I access your services heading 3 button? That adds a little bit of information I don't really need. So I could argue that this goes either way. This is technically compliant, and I can understand its reasoning. But as an accessibility expert, I might say this isn't as good an idea. What might be better is if I take that heading and split it out into subsections in the FAQ, like, how do I access services, or services and operations, and then have a separate section of filling out our forms or something like that, where I break up my FAQ into multiple sections and multiple questions with those headings instead. Now let's look at the button itself. We still have the button, the tag. So that's the HTML element that tells us what it does, or in this case has behavior to it. But then it adds type equals button, which tells this act as a button. That's kind of redundant. Why should I tell a button to act as a button? So that was something I would argue is not needed at all. It doesn't hurt it, it just makes no sense. We still have the class, so that tells it again, if I use this styling, apply it to all of these things. And now the important thing is that we have ARIA expanded. So it tells screen reader or voice control or something else, announce the state of this item when it's found or when it's pressed, as long as the JavaScript is there. It did write the JavaScript, it just couldn't fit it on screen. We'll look at it later. So the ARIA expanded now is there so that it tells us when we find this button, how do I access your services button collapsed. So I already know this is not open yet. If the JavaScript is written right and I activate this button, it will say expanded, and then the section below will appear on screen. The ARIA controls below it is just another add-on that helps connect this button to its following section. It's useful. Sometimes you can get away with not having it. I would call it a best practice. It improves things, but it's not always necessary because usually, you have your button and then the section below it. It's more important if you have them like either, somehow side by side or for some reason backwards. Um, it might help, but ultimately, eh. And then the ID just allows us to make sure that we're pointing to specific elements. The section below has the FAQ answer, and it has role equals region, which is again something I would argue isn't necessary because what a region does is group things together. It makes it a whole area. That's a behavior of one, the div tag. And then B, since the only thing here is a single paragraph, the role doesn't really serve a purpose here other than just telling us, again, this is a group. It might tell a screen reader this is one whole section. It might treat it as one section, which might be useful if you had multiple points of content in there, but I'm not so sure it's really useful in this context. So this is something that I would consider if I added more content or if I needed to change things. And then the ARIA labeled by pointing back at the button means that when it highlights this section, it reads that heading again. So it will tell us, how do I access your services? You can access our services by creating an account on our website and navigating to blah, blah, blah. This is technically compliant, as in, if you're just looking at code and you're labeling things, it's correct. This is where I would want to run it past a native screen reader user and be like, is this actually useful? Because you already have the button that you had to press in order to open this section. So you should already know that this is connected to it. And so why do I need to hear it again with the label when I move to the region to read the content that I just added to the screen? My first thought is I don't need that. Other users might say, no, that's a good idea because it makes it absolutely sure, especially if I move away from that and then come back to it. So this is where we get from, what is technically accessible to what is a good user experience and what is actually useful and efficient for a user and what is a personal preference. So looking at this as a whole, there are a few things that I would change more for purposes of making it a better experience and more efficient, but it is technically compliant because we have the ARIA expanded, we have the JavaScript that it functions, and we have proper headings for everything and button labels. So it's compliant. And if you took this and put it out there, I would just be like, man, you could make it better, but it still works. And so that's the key thing to take away here is without telling it to do this, it's not going to. To help you with that, we have some suggestions to improve accessibility in your prompts. You saw these in just now with that example. Is first, give it a persona. Tell it, act as a senior front-end developer, add on digital accessibility expert, anything like that. This is something you'll see a lot in more, AI focused or AI presentations is by telling it, act as this job, it's going to pull from areas that have some kind of connotation with that job. So it helps it at least give it some kind of direction to find the correct information rather than just say, go make this accessible. Because if you do that, I don't know where it's pulling from, and it's likely going to hallucinate or put in the wrong thing or give you things that work but aren't the right thing. That'll come up a lot with your documents and your descriptions. If you're telling it, write alt text for me, it's just going to give you alt text based on what it sees in the image and how it compares to other images. So you might get this long winded page that's way too much. Or it might give you, this is a dog. I mean, that's correct, but what kind of dog is it? Or what is that? How is that relevant to what I'm talking about? So, like in the case of my screenshot, it could maybe give me the entire breakdown of the HTML, which is too much for alt text, or it could just say HTML code. That doesn't point out the things that I was talking about in my presentation. So that's where you need to tell it, I need you to do X, Y, Z, and or act as this kind of person who would write those things, and it would do that. This also comes up a lot with refinement too, or if you're using it to brainstorm things, either acting as like a particular researcher or a technical writer or anything like that. Again, helps it to narrow down what it's using as reference material. Second thing is create a custom instructions document with some of these prompts already available to you. We created one for inside the state that's shared through the AI community of practice. It should still be in their technical document. I don't think I can share it outside the state. I'm sorry for those of you who are not, but a lot of it is kind of the similar things that you saw on screen. And if you reach out, I can probably help you create one or at least pull some from it. But ultimately, you're looking at creating some specific rules. I need to add keyboard accessibility uh, with either a tab index or a visual focus indicator telling I need to do this. Add a visual focus indicator using this style. Add a keyboard accessibility to this menu with tab index and ARIA. Tell it to label all your buttons correctly and to add functionality for all of those. If you're using it to design anything like a flyer or generate content or refine content, like take this outline and turn it into a slide deck. Tell it I need to maintain a 4.5 to 1 color contrast for all my text. Because if it doesn't do that, it might create something that looks pretty based on a template, but doesn't hit that ratio that we have to be compliant and to be accessible. When you're prompting, include accessibility from the beginning. This is something that has come up a lot in Maryland with both the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility at University of Maryland, with us inside the state at the initiative or at the Office of Accessibility and Do It. You'll hear about it throughout the accessibility field. Born accessible. Because if you include it from the start, tell it to generate this code or this item, this document or what have you, and make it accessible, it makes it a lot easier than trying to add it out at the end or build it in later. Because, and we'll see an example of that shortly, without that, you're doing patches or you're telling it, I need to add this later or add this part. And that's when we start getting into that problem of you're trying to fix specific instances and it fixes that instance, but doesn't fix it all across the board, or it fixes that, but then it breaks something else that's relying on. Um, if it prompts you to, consider this improvement, like add a focus indicator or add a listener to do this thing, would you like me to add? Think about it. It might be something you should add, especially if you've told it, you know, and I'll show this in a bit. We've added ARIA expanded, but did we add ARIA controls? And then finally, most important thing is test it. Make sure it works. If you're creating something with a user interface or you're creating a document like a slide deck or a Word document or a flyer or something, at minimum, run an automated check. It's, and prompt it to fix it based on what you find. Because at the very least, even if automated testing only finds like a third of accessibility issues, it at least takes care of some of the real basic problems like you forgot to add alt text, or this can't work with a keyboard, or we don't have that contrast ratio available. I mean, if we take care of at least those, then we can get to a point where we can start getting user feedback. If you have the time, or if you're building something that's going to be much more publicly available, like say you're building an app, like a prototype, and you're going to need to run it through testing, include accessibility testing with an expert, especially if you can get help from a person or multiple people with disabilities, because then you can take their feedback, put it into your AI prompting, and refine it. That was a really good webinar I saw a few months ago that they had a native screen reader user and a developer on screen going back and forth with a website that they were vibe coding, quote unquote. And developer, created the initial website, and did some things well, like adding headings or adding basic navigation. So it can handle some things automatically because it's just good practice, quote unquote. I need to stop doing that. I'm sorry. Um, but it didn't do things like interactions well, and that was the big problem they found, was that it would tell it, create a nav menu. The screen reader would go to it, would hear it's a menu, but it was missing, buttons to actually open the drop downs, or it would open the drop down, but the drop down would disappear because it initially made it with a hover effect instead of focus. And so you would have to tell it, go change hover to focus. When you press the button, open the menu. If I press the button again, close the menu. And they would, go through that cycle of using feedback to refine it, to make it fix it. But that's where we again saw the problem of, it would fix it in that one spot, but if you told it fix it across the board, it didn't do so well. So there's a lot of back and forth you're going to have to do with it. It's still useful, it's still faster. I mean, they built a website in under like half hour, I think, at least 2 pages worth. But there was a lot of little nitpicking and such, especially with interactions and feedback to assistive technology, that it really struggled to do. And that's where you're going to have to find, you might need to bring in experts to look at it and run through it before you actually use it. Now, JavaScript is an area I found a lot of challenges, and this was one uh, case study that came up actually in my work, where the person I was working with was a content manager for a website, but they couldn't alter a lot of the base level HTML or uh, scripting inside the web page because it was on a host platform that was just a content management system. So they created a collapsible section, an FAQ, but it was just that building block that you could drag over in like WordPress or something and put it onto the web page and say, fill it in, fill in the content. But you couldn't change the functionality of that building block. So we had to create a script to add ARIA expanded to that, because it wasn't a vendor that they had a contract with they could go to and say, do this. It was like, yeah, it was like WordPress or Squarespace or something like that, where it just existed and you couldn't, there was no one to talk to there to say, I need to add this to it. Or if there was, it was going to cost them. But the fellow had some JavaScript experience. So we created this prompt of, your front end web designer is a collapsible section on a web page that functions but does not announce its state to screen reader technology. I cannot edit the HTML directly, so I need to use a JavaScript function to insert ARIA expanded into the attributes of the activator button. Each activator uses the class framer. So it created a script to find and toggle ARIA expanded on each of those activators that use that class. But we had to do another prompt to add ARIA controls, which you saw in that example earlier. It also didn't give us the injection script. It just said, find this thing. If it has ARIA expanded, toggle it when it's pressed. But we needed to also actually add that attribute so it does it in the first place. So there was a series of prompts we had to do to fully flesh out this JavaScript. And we had to take all those parts and put it into a single file that would actually work. So it required knowledge on his end of how JavaScript is supposed to function in order to do it. It did give us tips on different activator types, like if it wasn't a button, do this, or if it was this kind of, div or whatever, add this in order to add button functionality. Um, so it did give us some useful info, but it relied on us to know how to implement that info. So now let's look at some of those examples in a bit more depth. So in this case, that was that first prompt I gave before, which is the generate HTML markup in JavaScript. We had that basic HTML. We had the styling it gave us, how it looks. So, is it just, how does it fit on screen? Is there a border? Blah, 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 color, what have you. Then it gives us the JavaScript of, in this case, there's something that's listening so that if you click it, it opens it and then also makes it visible and makes it fit on screen. It does, unprompted, tell us, hey, this is good for accessibility because we use the button tag. I mean, yes, that's true. I'm glad you thought of that, but it's not something I feel needs to be pointed out because it's just the base behavior of it. If you're thinking about accessibility, why didn't you do the other parts of it? And that's the complaint I have about it and what I'm telling you guys. But it does do some of these things automatically. So it is at least considering it. It's just not going the full length. One of the other things too that it points out using responsive so that it automatically adjusts to your screen width. If you're on a computer versus a phone, it will adjust to that screen. So it's great that it's already doing some of these base things. It's just not going the whole distance on its own, and that's our problem. So in the end, I pulled up a fiddle and put all that code in here. And it looks like this section in the bottom right here with frequently asked questions. And each of these uh, questions and such. I did notice that if I try to click one of these, it doesn't actually open because there's a couple errors in the JavaScript. Um, I didn't bother fixing it, but it's something I wanted to point out is that I've found sometimes it doesn't quite get the syntax for JavaScript, right? Or in this case, I think it's missing some other parts. So like it's saying, why is this here? Or there's a missing bracket here. So again, you might need to fiddle with it to get it fully functional. It doesn't seem to have that problem with HTML and CSS, uh, but it is something to be aware of. But ultimately, our big thing here is that we still need to tell it be accessible. We need to do all of these things. So in this case, it's like, okay, we're going to use ARIA expanded and ARIA controls. I also added region for better landmark navigation. So it did this based on what it's thinking it's finding as best practices. But this is where I would make the argument of it's great that you made regions, but you've made everything a region. And now I've defeated the point of being able to move around quickly because all of my elements are all in the same thing. You know, if I have just a list of headings, I can't use a heading to skip past all the headings. So this is where you would need to make a judgment call of, is this the best way to approach this or not? And how AI can't consider context of, yes, technically this is correct behavior, but in the long, or the big picture, it's actually annoying and something I would not do. But then it has, all of that FAQ or all of those ARIA expanded and ARIA controls that we talked about before. It also gives us the accessibility logic of finding aria expanded and switching it to true or switching it to false. Um, or switching it rather. So toggling it based on is it open or not, which is great. It also explains to us why it does that. So we can at least have an understanding of what it does. And if you're working with an accessibility expert, I'd send them this so that they knew uh, what it was thinking. And also, unprompted, told us, hey, you should also add a focus indicator. Great. So that's wonderful. This should be something you include. So we should take this CSS and throw it into our CSS styling sheet over here. But we need to make sure that A, we take that, and then B, we need to think about is this the right color for what we're doing? It gave us a color here that I would need to find out, but is that color going to fit on our background or not? Or would it fit on all of our backgrounds? So I need to test that. And this is how I was saying it would tell us, hey, do you want to consider this other option? Do you want to add keyboard navigation logic so I can use up down arrows to move between them instead of just using tab? Maybe, maybe not. But it's something, it's good that it's prompting it, so you should always think about it. In some cases in FAQ, if there's only like 5 questions, I think a user can mostly get away with just tab. But if you have like a focusable region and like 20 questions or like multiple groups of questions, up and down arrow might be something you can expect users to use. So it's again, what is optimal, what is best? I would say add this. So I would tell it do so. But it is something that you need to make that judgment call of do you think that's accessible or not? Because if it was asking me, do you want to add ARIA live for reading out the content? I would say no, because our user's going to be really annoyed to hear button and then hear all of this content read to them automatically. And then the other example I wanted to show was the JavaScript function. So it gave us a solution of find these framers, um, and if it has that attribute, set that attribute to this, and then if you press the button, switch it. The problem is that it just said set it to false if it's not already there, but we already knew it wasn't there. So we need to tell it, no, I need you to add that attribute to all of these buttons with that class. Going back up, just a notice thing, again, quick pro tip is that if your activator is a different kind of thing, we were talking about that earlier, it will give you other ways to do this. So this is where you would need to look at your web page and say, am I using buttons or am I using a div or a span? In which case I would need to use these options here to make it function like a button so that this script works. But then it also didn't actually uh, give me, or it didn't give me the injection thing. So that's why I had to tell it to make that for me. So now it has that, and it also has, again, the focus ability here, but then it also has, hey, do you want a listener so that you can also trigger that section using enter space keys? That's something that it should have done if it was a button. So this is where I'm like, it shouldn't need that. And this is where I might get concerned about the over engineering because now it's starting to add roll equals button, tab index, and keyboard listeners so that you can use enter space when that should be native behavior. And so now we're getting a redundancy. And either it's going to announce its like state 3 times of like this is a button that does this and is focusable, and this is what it does, or it might start interfering because space no longer works for whatever reason because you have 2 scripts running at the same time. So this is where testing really would come involved of like, do I need that or not? Okay. Um, with that, I have reached the end. Um, do we have any questions? Because I know, again, I was talking mostly about coding, but some of this does apply to your documents or to your refining something. If you're taking like a bullet list and saying, create a flyer out of this or create an email out of this, it's not going to do some of this on its own. You still have to tell it, I need you to be accessible, or I need, proper contrast ratio, anything like that. So again, your final takeaway from this is it's not going to do it for you. You have to tell it what to do and verify it yourself, like you hear in all of the other AI webinars out ever. Add that human verification step. Let me, I just realized I need to open the Q&A. Okay, I don't see any questions. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.